Hi everyone, I'm Heath, and in this video we are continuing our series where we are comparing and contrasting the d20 versus 2d10 and 3d6, where we've got some tables here and we're breaking down the numbers and really trying to look and understand what effect those different number generation systems have on the game. I'm particularly interested in how often the dice determine success or failure versus how often the player or the character's skill will actually determine success or failure. My personal interest is kind of shifting from the dice to the skill of the player being the more determinative factor. And in the last video, we took a look at the d20 in detail, and so now we're going to swap over and start taking a look at 2d10 and some other systems. So here we were looking at the rolling a d20 with a plus 10 modifier, DC 25, and we said that 70% of the time success was determined by the roll of the die, 30% of the time it was determined by the character's skill, and that was because in this case 25 is something that you can't reach anyway just with the dice. So that's where we left it last time. Now let's swap over to start talking about the 2d10. So we're kind of resetting here a bit. We're rolling 2d10, which means it's not possible to roll a 1. We're going between 2 and 20. And now I also have this column here that is the percent chance that any one of those numbers will be rolled, because when we were dealing with the d20, of course, it was a 5% chance that any one of the number would be rolled. But this time we're changing things up because we've got a little bit more of a bell curve shape to the probability here. So here's our percentages that we'll be adding up as we go. So here, if we are rolling 2d10, we've got a plus 5 modifier, and then our DC is 15 right here. Okay, so what effect does this have? Does it change it up at all? Is it actually doing what we're trying to accomplish here, or I'm trying to accomplish here? So if we roll 2 through 9, we are failing basically regardless of our modifier, regardless of the skill, and then also if we roll 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, or 20, we are once again in the hands of the die. In those cases, it's determining success. So if we add up all of these numbers here, that means that 57% of the time success or failure of the task is determined by the roll of the die, which is still quite a bit. Then if we roll any of these numbers here, because we have a plus 5 modifier, we succeed. And if we add up all of those percentages, we find out that 43% of the time, the success or failure of the task is determined by the skill of the character, even though here we have a total chance of success of 64%. So let's compare to the d20. So 57% of the time here, we are determined by the dice. Here, 75% of the time, we're determined by the dice. 25% of the time, the skill was the determining factor. Here, 43% of the time, success or failure is determined by the skill of the character. So for an initial stab at this, I would say that this is moving in the right direction. We have not quite doubled, but almost doubled the influence that the character's skill has on the outcome of the die roll, which is what we're trying to move toward. 43% of the time, contrasting with 25% of the time, the skill is the decisive factor. Now, we have also slightly increased the chance of success on a DC 15 check, which will alter the game a little bit because it makes the DC 15 checks a little bit easier to make. But on the whole, this is still pretty random. 57% of the time, the dice are the determining factor on the check. So this is better, I think, definitely moving in the direction I'd want to go, but still, there's a lot of dependency on the dice here. Next, let's check out a DC 13 check. So here again, we're rolling 2d10, we've got a plus 5 modifier. How does reducing the DC from 15 to 13 actually change things? Well, here, we've got, these are all failures right here, regardless of our modifier. And then these right here, if you roll 13 or above, we are also succeeding without our modifier. And so if we add up our percentage chance of rolling those numbers, we find out that 57% of the time, the success or failure of the task is determined by the roll of the die. And then you can see where I'm going here, probably. These numbers right here, if you roll an 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12, then you succeed, but only because of the modifier of the character, which is plus 5. Which means that 43% of the time, the success or failure of the task is determined by the skill of the character. Interesting, right? Where have we seen those numbers before? It happens to be the same numbers that we had previously when we were looking at the DC 15. 57% of the time, the failure or success of the task was determined by the dice. 43% of the time, it was determined by the skill of the character. Here, same thing, 57 versus 43. Although here, because we've lowered it from DC 15 to DC 13, we now have a total chance of success of 79%. That is up from 64%. So actually, we can see that something very similar happened here that happened also when we were rolling the d20 alone. Because remember here, when we were taking a look at the DC 18, this was rolling the d20, we saw that 75% of the time the task success or failure was determined by the die, 25% of the time success or failure was determined by the skill of the character, and that didn't change just because we went to a DC 15. So we got the same situation down here when we are working with the 2d10. Whether we're at DC 15 or 13, the determining factor is still the dice. It has less influence, but it's still the determining factor. I don't think we need to go and do a whole lot of other DCs with the 2d10s, but I would say that it helps, and I was an advocate of the 2d10 system, and I still am as far as an easy and general tweak to D&D at the table. Unearthed Arcana covers some different things. So there are already some existing alternate rules that might help you make some adjustments using 2d10 instead of d20. Help increase the influence of the skill of the player and not just the random roll. But on the other hand, the numbers that you're generating are very similar to the roll of the d20. You're just not able to roll a 1. So I would say this helps and is a direction I would move in. But interestingly, it doesn't help as much as I was expecting it to. So actually, I kind of think that we need to press this further and try to have even greater influence of the skill over the influence of the dice. So let's try to push this further. How could we do that? Well, we could change up the dice that we're rolling. What if we reduce the dice that we're rolling to, say, 2d8? So just as an example here, what if we then say, hey, let's go and roll a 2d8, and this time we've still got our +5 modifier that we're talking about because of skill, proficiency, magic items, ability, whatever it is. We got a +5 modifier, and we're trying to complete a DC 13 task. So that means that here, if we roll 2 through 7, we have once again failed regardless of what our modifier was. And then if we roll 13 through 16, so 16 is our top number now because we're rolling 2d8, we're generating a number between 2 and 16. Well, if we roll any of those numbers, we also succeed regardless of what our modifier was. So that means that 48.45% of the time, the success or failure of this task is determined by the roll of the die. So that means that these numbers right here, if we roll an 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12, we will succeed a DC 13 check because of the skill of the character, and that means that 51.57% of the time the success or failure of the task is determined by the skill of the character for a total chance of success of 67.2%. Now, of course, a major change that this would be making is that you can no longer roll 17, 18, 19s, or 20s at all, which does mean that you have to change up your critical range or whatever, and that's probably a larger kind of influence on the game. So I'm not exactly recommending starting to roll 2d8 for Dungeons & Dragons specifically. We're just taking a look at the influence that has on our probability and our numbers, because now we would have to rely on character skill to get up to 17, 18, 19, or 20, whereas previously we just had to rely on character skill to get up above 20, 21 plus. So I was also a little bit surprised by this. So in this case, 48.45% of the time, the success is determined by the dice. 51.57% of the time, the success or failure is determined by the skill of the character. So we have moved up the skill again from 43% to 51%, but it's not that large of an increase. And check this out, we're basically at a coin flip. We're basically at a 50-50 chance. We now are edging out just slightly on the side of the player character, finally. But, I mean, this is still pretty random. +5 modifier, DC 13, you're still at a coin flip. Just to continue to prove what happens with the 2d8, let's go here, but let's reduce our DC by 1 this time. Let's say we're going to a DC 12. So if we roll a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we fail because of the dice. If we roll a 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, we have succeeded because of the dice. That means that 46.88% of the time, the success or failure of the task is determined by the roll of the die, which means that if we roll 7, 8, 9, 10, or 11, that's when the character's skill comes into play, and that's at 53.14% of the time. So here we did increase, of course, the chance of success because we reduced the DC, but still, we are still really close to 50-50, with a slight edge to the player. If you want to take it further, as one more example, if we go here to 2d8 plus 5, but we reduce the DC to 15, well, of course, now we have a really good chance of success because we've got a large modifier. But here we've got failure and success. Once again, 53.14% of the time we're determining success or failure with the dice. And then here we're determining it with player skill, which is 46.88% of the time. Total chance of success is 90.64. But once again, man, we are still close to a coin flip. In this one, it's interesting, we kind of went down with the influence of the skill of the character, but man, we are still very close to a coin flip. At the table, you're probably feeling the coin flip, I guess. What if we go even further and go to 2d6? We could definitely roll 2d6. And of course, as we were having a discussion in the comments section on other videos, an advantage of 2d6 is that everyone has them. You know, they can come out of other board games. GURPS uses 3d6, so it's easy to access 6-sided dice for GURPS. But on the other hand, everyone likes to roll polyhedral dice. And so I find that 2d6s, or just the d6s in general, are some of the least favorite dice for everybody to roll at the table because they are so kind of standard dice. So that's not important from the mathematics or the number side of things, but it could influence game design and gameplay. So that might be a reason, kind of a human reason, not to use d6s. I remember that Decipher's Lord of the Rings game used 2d6 plus modifier, and I enjoyed that game. I thought that there was more to do with that game than was done with it. There were only a couple of books released, 2 or 3 books released for it. But I think that a lot of people didn't like the fact that it was 2d6 plus a modifier. But let's take a look at those numbers right here. So if you are rolling 2d6, so we're generating a number between 2 and 12, here is our percent chance for all of those. That means the head and shoulder of our number distribution is around 7. So you can see 7 is, of course, the most common number to be rolled. Followed up by 6 and 8. This time, let's say we're trying to do a target of 10. And so if we roll a 2, 3, or 4 with a +5 modifier still, we will automatically fail. The dice determine that. If we roll a 10, 11, or 12, the dice will determine that we succeed. That means that 33.26% of the time, the success or failure of the task is determined by the roll of the die. Ah, interesting. Okay, I like the way this is going. So if we go here, if we roll a 5 through 9, we have succeeded because of our skill, and that means that 66.67% of the time, the success or failure of the task is determined by the skill of the character, with a total chance of success of 83.26 on a DC 10 check, with a +5 modifier. I would say that this starts to look a lot better. Now we have definitely swung the determining factor to the player's skill. And we're at 2 to 1, basically, right? 66 versus 33%. You are probably definitely feeling that at the table this time. What matters? Well, my skill. 33% of the time, I'm in the range of the dice, but 66% of the time here, the attributes of my character are what are carrying the day even more. So I like that. Although, of course, we are a far cry from the d20 now, and, even the 2d10. Now we've drastically changed up our number distribution. And, of course, once again, I don't recommend going 2d6 for Dungeons & Dragons, because now we've eliminated the ability to roll 13 or above, which is a large chunk of the numbers. But nonetheless, if you're talking about system design, or like we were just talking about the Decipher Lord of the Rings game, if you were designing a system around something other than the d20, like the 2d6, well, now we can start to redesign a system that empowers the character even more. Just for fun, let's take a look at a 2d4 system. So if we're rolling 2d4, then our number becomes 5. We're generating a number between 2 and 8. The head and shoulders of our distribution are the 5, surrounded by the 4 and the 6. And, well, okay, here I have a DC 10. So if we're still trying to get to a DC 10, but I got a +5 modifier, this one is a bit different because, of course, you can't, because the highest number you can roll is 8, so there's no probability that you're going to be successful based on just the dice, the way I set this up. But here, failure without the modification, that happens 62.5% of the time. And then here, this is 37.5% of the time. But anyway, I suppose this was really interesting to me because once we started looking at the numbers behind the 2d10, even though I definitely liked the way that it was going, it doesn't go far enough for me, actually. I was expecting for it to actually do a bit more. So according to my current line of thinking now, I think we need to push this even further. with the design of some kind of system. And of course, all of this has just been kind of talking out notes and talking out loud, thinking through different things about RPGs. But this breakdown was very useful to me, because if I were thinking up a system, I was already thinking we should go with 2d10 or something like that. But this has convinced me we need to go even further, or I need to go even further. I want a system that is much more dependent on the skill of the characters, and so even a 2d10 system, even though it moves the needle, is not really accomplishing what I want to accomplish at the table with a system that I would put together, I think, just talking through this out loud. I don't know where to go from here. I will have to think a lot more about it, so that could be the subjects of videos to come. But in the meantime, did you learn anything here? What do you think? Please let me know it down in the comments below. I read them all, and I really appreciate everyone who is helping to extend the conversation. You guys are fantastic. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and all of that jazz. It really helps a lot. But also, please check out The Cultists, the web series on this channel about modern-day D&D playing Lovecraftian cultists who just want to worship Cthulhu in a world full of people who just don't understand. Season 1 is on the channel now. But also, please check out my YouTube channel. I have over 150 videos on tabletop games and the fantasy genre. If you've enjoyed this video, you might enjoy many of them as well. I look forward to seeing you for them and many more videos to come.